It was the Austrian-American management consultant, educator and author Peter Drucker who said, "If you can't measure it, you can't change it." We have, it seems, a terribly hard time measuring innovation, and on even agreeing on what measurements are most appropriate. And this all adds to a confusion about how good or bad or any nation really is at innovation. The impacts of change, in this case innovation, is usually measured in terms of the value of an input relative to that of an output. Inputs are resources invested in accomplishing a task and typically include time, money, and effort. In economics, inputs refer to the elements of production that go into the process of creating a product or a service. The output then is the finished product, process, or service. Financial models tend to compare inputs and outputs in terms of the benefit to cost ratio, the BCR, that's used to determine whether the amount of money made through a project will be greater than the cost incurred in its execution. If the costs outweigh the benefits, then the project does not deliver value for money, under the assumed conditions anyway. Although a well-established means of understanding relative merits or otherwise of projects, use of the BCR and even inputs and outputs is not something that has been transferred readily to innovation. Even in the scholarly literature, little effort is made to actually differentiate between inputs and outputs, and the distinction between the two is rarely applied to policy making either. Although, of course, there are always exceptions to this sort of generalization. Part of the difficulty with the inputs and outputs of innovation is that they are many and varied, are scale and development stage dependent, and they're sometimes difficult to elucidate and measure, leading to the use of proxies, which are themselves can easily complicate matters further. However, the lack of consideration of innovation inputs and outputs may not only lead to overstatement of achievement in innovation at an institutional or company level, but also misunderstandings of the significance of its role as a driver of national economic performance. Direct measures of innovative output are most scarce, the most difficult to measure, and sadly the most needed. Inputs tend to be easier to determine, to measure, and to control. Hence, an emphasis is always given to inputs. For example, the Global Innovation Index prioritizes scientific publications and R&D expenditure as indicators of innovation. R&D expenditure is an input, and publications an output of research, not innovation. At present, there is no real consensus about whether there is evidence to link R&D spending directly to, for instance, to company performance. And it's not clear either that greater R&D expenditures lead to greater innovation outcomes anyway. At best, the innovation literature demonstrates that R&D can work as part of the innovation input, but that it is not necessarily the most important input and cannot guarantee a proportional innovation output. All of this identifies the need for greater precision, firstly in defining the nature of research undertaking, and here one of my contributions is that adopting more meaningful definitions for the different types of researchers, scholarly, practitioner, trade or custom research, is of value. Secondly, a more considered appreciation of the difference and role of inputs and outputs, the use of appropriate measures relating to particular stages of development and the scales of operation, the levels of commitment to innovation. Thirdly, where proxies have to be used, then a clear articulation of their limitations is needed, and they have to be explained. In Chapter 10, Volume 1 of my book, I make an attempt to differentiate between inputs and outputs at different stages of the innovation process, pardon me, and by different actors and institutions. This consideration is by no means comprehensive or exhaustive, but It's used to identify possibilities that may exist all the way from an invention through to a fully fledged business. There is yet much more that can be and should be done in this area if we really wish to understand innovative performance at any level.